The ink was barely dry when palace aides began whispering. Prince William, heir to the throne, had signed something no one expected, an unprecedented document bypassing a senior royal and awarding Prince George a historic naval title. It wasn't just about a title. It was about rewriting legacy, upending tradition, and sending shockwaves through the royal bloodline. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The document in question wasn't some ceremonial certificate handed out to placate a young heir. It was a legally binding directive, quietly drafted and approved under the radar of royal traditionalists. And at its heart was the title of Admiral of the Fleet, a name etched in British maritime history, previously granted only to those with battle-hardened experience or time-tempered seniority. Yet, this time, it didn't go to the man many believed was the rightful heir. Peter Phillips, Queen Elizabeth II's eldest grandchild, and a royal who had served with quiet dignity for decades, was suddenly sidelined. His name had long been whispered in military circles as the one who would carry the naval lineage forward. But William had other plans. What made this move even more stunning wasn't just the bypassing of Peter, but who received the honour instead. Prince George, still in the early bloom of adolescence, had been chosen as the new bearer of this ancient title, a child given the naval honour once reserved for war heroes and seasoned royals. It left the establishment rattled. George, third in line to the throne, was already being prepared behind the scenes for a destiny most children can barely imagine. Yet this title, awarded so prematurely, marked more than symbolism, it marked intent. William was signalling that his son was no longer simply a future king-in-waiting. He was now active in the machinery of monarchy. This wasn't just a father showing confidence in his son. According to insiders, the move was calculated. It was bold. It was a power play, one rooted in legacy, strategy, and quiet rebellion. William had spent years watching the monarchy drift under the weight of outdated customs. This document was his attempt to steer it forward on his terms. The naval title was merely the tip of the spear. But the real target? The system that had always placed tradition above transformation. The circumstances of the signing were shrouded in secrecy. A private council was called in the early hours, away from the public eye. No press, no cameras, just a handful of trusted aides and legal advisors. When the seal was pressed, the tides shifted, and when word began to trickle out, Sandringham and Windsor both stirred with disbelief. Questions erupted. Why now? Why George? And why ignore Peter Phillips, a man with both experience and quiet loyalty? In truth, the answers are far more layered than a mere case of favoritism. They lie within the shifting alliances of the royal household, where old wounds still bleed beneath polished smiles. Whispers suggest that William had grown wary not just of public perception, but of the inner forces that once shaped his own path. Elevating George was not an act of affection, but of necessity. A chess move in a game where every title, every nod, every document carries the weight of dynastic power. But to understand why William would defy tradition and elevate his son over a seasoned royal, we must dive into the unspoken rivalries that have quietly brewed within the House of Windsor. He was always the royal, with no title, but undeniable blood. Peter Phillips, the Queen's eldest grandchild, played the loyal soldier, but was loyalty ever enough in a family where optics trump bloodlines? When the naval title slipped through his fingers, Peter's silence became deafening. For years, Peter moved within royal circles with the quiet dignity of a man who knew his place close enough to the crown to feel its weight, yet distant enough to be forgotten by it. The firstborn of Princess Anne and the first grandchild of Queen Elizabeth II, his lineage alone should have secured him a revered place in the royal hierarchy. But the absence of a title, a choice made by his mother to afford him a normal life, ultimately became the very thing that marked him as expendable in the eyes of the institution. He was present, dependable, scandal-free, and yet he was never truly included in the machinery of power. His loyalty was taken for granted, his silence mistaken for acceptance. What makes the snub even more cutting is Peter's deep-rooted connection to the armed forces. Though not a combat officer himself, his involvement in military events and his long-standing association with royal ceremonial duties had made him the favoured candidate for the naval honour within palace corridors. Whispers from those close to the royal household spoke of quiet preparations, of advisors aligning behind Peter for the Admiral of the Fleet distinction. It was to be a recognition not just of service, but of lineage, an attempt to finally integrate the sidelined grandson into the fold. But instead, that legacy was handed to a boy not yet of age. Peter's response was nothing short of stoic. He did not publicly contest the decision, nor did he issue any form of dissent. But behind closed doors, his composure reportedly cracked. Trusted confidantes revealed that Peter felt the blow not as a betrayal, but as a confirmation that his role in the family would always be that of the reliable bystander, never the chosen heir. Conversations once cordial became strained, invitations subtly thinned. It was as if the very act of voicing his hurt had exiled him further into the shadows of royal indifference. The media picked up on the tension almost immediately. Headlines drew sharp contrasts between Peter's decades of loyalty and Prince George's sudden elevation. Commentators questioned whether the palace had once again sacrificed substance for spectacle, youth over earned stature. Social media lit up with frustration, sympathy, and outrage, especially from older generations who remembered Peter as the golden boy of the Queen's early grandmotherhood. It wasn't just a snub. It was a statement that heritage without influence means little in a monarchy now dictated by narrative and perception. Still, Peter said nothing. He didn't need to. His absence from recent royal engagements, his notable distance from family ceremonies, and the stiffness in once warm interactions painted a picture clearer than any interview ever could. He had become the cautionary tale, the royal who gave everything, only to watch it all pass to another. But whispers suggest this wasn't just about Peter losing out. It was about George being prepared for something far greater, far sooner than anyone anticipated. Prince George's schoolbooks may still have ink stains, but behind palace walls, he's already being trained for power. This naval title is just the beginning. Sources say the young prince is receiving a fast-tracked royal education with lessons fit for a king-in-waiting. The title was never meant to be ornamental. It was the first stone laid on a carefully constructed path toward inevitable authority. George, barely into his teenage years, is being ushered into a world most grown men aren't prepared for. His days, once filled with harmless lessons in history and literature, are now slowly being replaced with strategic briefings, simulated decision-making scenarios, and, according to insiders, detailed overviews of royal precedent, governance, and military command. He's not just being taught how to reign, he's being taught how to lead. And that distinction between symbolism and actual control is what makes this transformation so alarming to those watching closely. Because this isn't tradition, this is acceleration. And it's being done with one clear intent: to mold a sovereign before the throne even nears him. At the heart of this ambitious shaping is his mother, Catherine. Her involvement in George's development has gone far beyond the expected warmth of maternal guidance. It is said that she orchestrates his schedule with military precision, ensuring he balances both his youthful innocence and the burden of legacy. She's instilled in him a sense of duty, restraint, and responsibility rarely seen in children his age. Behind every lesson is a larger message. You were not born to be ordinary. You were born to carry the crown. And according to royal insiders, it is Catherine who remains firm on discipline, manners, public conduct, even controlling which friendships are permitted to flourish. She isn't just raising a child, she's crafting a monarch. Meanwhile, King Charles's presence in George's grooming remains eerily minimal. Some believe the king prefers to remain distant, trusting William and Catherine to modernize royal preparation. Others believe it's something far more unsettling, that Charles sees in George what he feared most in William, an heir moving faster and further than expected. Whatever the reason, the king's passivity has left a vacuum, and William has filled it with quiet authority. George's naval title, then, becomes more than symbolism. It is the opening chapter of William's master plan. William knows the dangers of being unprepared. He lived it, watched his mother fall to public pressure, saw his father stumble through scandal, and endured the chaos that defined his own rise. He's vowed not to let George inherit a monarchy without armor. So, in private, George is receiving counsel from constitutional experts, retired generals, and former palace aides, each handpicked by William to pass on wisdom that history failed to preserve for him. It's a form of protection, but also control. The contrast with Prince Harry's chaotic journey could not be more stark. Where Harry was allowed freedom and folly, George's path is narrow and unyielding. There's no room for error. No indulgence in youthful rebellion. The stakes are too high. William isn't just shaping a son, he's attempting to correct the course of a family he believes nearly collapsed from within. Yet even within the walls of privilege, such acceleration doesn't come without consequences, and it wasn't long before factions within the royal household began pushing back. Behind every move in the royal chessboard is a countermove, and this time, it came from a faction few expected: Camilla's inner circle. Sources reveal a covert campaign was launched to challenge George's premature elevation and expose the fractures it caused behind palace doors. While William quietly celebrated a bold step forward for his son, Queen Camilla reportedly seethed behind palace curtains. To those close to her, the appointment of Prince George as Admiral of the Fleet wasn't a sign of progress, it was a direct insult to the established order. She saw it not only as a snub to Peter Phillips, whom she had grown to admire for his dignity and restraint, but also as a blatant undermining of royal protocol. What angered her most was the method, not the outcome. A private signature, no council-wide consensus, and a decision that seemed to deliberately sidestep her husband, the reigning monarch. It wasn't just overreach. It was rebellion disguised as legacy building. And Camilla, long underestimated, was not about to let it go unchecked. Tensions inside the palace began to thicken like fog. Charles's longtime advisors, staunch believers in hierarchy, order, and gradual reform, were blindsided by the abruptness of George's appointment. They believed decisions of such symbolic weight should be rooted in legacy and endorsed by tradition. Meanwhile, William's younger, more modern circle defended the move as necessary evolution. They argued that in an age where perception shapes power, waiting was a luxury the crown could no longer afford. But in truth, it was never about George. It was about control, about whose vision would define the next era of monarchy, and Camilla wasn't ready to surrender her seat at the table. Behind the scenes, Camilla's confidantes reportedly initiated a subtle yet potent campaign. It wasn't public, but it was piercing. Gentle whispers to key figures about Peter's value. Calls placed to senior officials with reminders of precedents and protocol. There was even talk, never confirmed, but never denied, that a formal request was made to Charles to consider an honorary role for Peter to balance the scales. But it wasn't just about offering Peter a title. It was about making it clear that Camilla's circle would not be cast aside without resistance. What began as quiet discontent soon found its way into the press. Leaks began emerging, small at first, but precise. Stories suggesting George's appointment lacked proper vetting. Speculative editorials questioning whether William had overstepped. Commentators highlighting Peter's glaring omission from recent family events. Nothing outright explosive, but enough to plant doubt in the minds of the public. The old guard was flexing its muscle, not with fury, but with finesse. Their message was simple. If William thought he could make moves unchecked, he'd find himself surrounded by adversaries hiding in plain sight. But this wasn't just an external battle. The rumblings reached William's own allies. Whispers of concern began to spread. Had the move been too ambitious, too fast? Had he risked destabilizing the already fragile equilibrium within the palace? Loyalty, once unquestioned, began to splinter. Even within his trusted circle, some feared that the boldness that once defined William's leadership might now be its greatest threat. But Camilla wasn't the only one disturbed by the shift within William's own ranks. Some questioned whether he'd acted too soon, or worse, without full consent. Queen Elizabeth II may be gone, but her legacy is anything but quiet. Family insiders claim her final wishes included specific roles for her grandchildren, and Prince George receiving this title was not among them. Has William dishonoured his grandmother's silent will? In the aftermath of the document signing, a new wave of whispers began to surface, not about George, nor even about Peter, but about the Queen herself. According to sources close to the palace, Queen Elizabeth had carefully mapped out ceremonial expectations for each of her grandchildren in the twilight years of her reign. While never made public, it is believed she conveyed her desires to Charles in a sealed letter, one reportedly opened only after her passing. That letter, some say, explicitly suggested Peter Phillips should be granted a formal naval honour, a long overdue nod to his unyielding loyalty. If that letter truly exists, and if it did favour Peter, then William's bold manoeuvre wasn't just controversial. It may have flown in direct opposition to the Queen's unspoken command, a move that would raise not only eyebrows but questions of legacy, loyalty, and defiance. Princess Anne, always the enforcer of tradition and protector of her mother's values, was said to be livid when the news of George's title reached her. For Anne, this wasn't simply about a missed opportunity for her son, it was a betrayal of order. Sources reveal that she privately confronted William in a tense exchange days after the announcement. The conversation, though undocumented, has been described as frosty at best, with Anne allegedly reminding William that not all crowns are visible, and that respect for the late Queen's intentions should have outweighed the rush for royal reform. Behind her words was a deeper message. Legacy isn't just inherited, it's honoured. And in her eyes, William had broken that pact. The title, Admiral of the Fleet, held a unique reverence under Elizabeth's reign. It wasn't simply a ceremonial honour, it was a symbol of steadfastness, of continuity, and of the Crown's deep-rooted ties to the armed forces. It was a title reserved for wisdom, not whim, for those who had proven endurance in service or stature. Under Queen Elizabeth, appointments like this were never made for symbolism alone. They were deliberate acts, meant to reinforce the monarchy's relationship with the people. William's decision to thrust George into that legacy without first earning the weight of it felt to many like a rupture. A generational shift that cut too deep, too fast. Royal historians are now divided. Some defend William's choice as a necessary evolution, a break from outdated customs in favour of youthful relevance. Others argue that stripping titles of their earned meaning does more harm than good, especially when it overrides the moral compass of the late Queen. For a monarchy already walking a tightrope between modern relevance and historic reverence, the clash between tradition and ambition couldn't be more glaring. But perhaps the most unsettling part is this. The Queen may have seen it coming. Insiders claim she expressed concern in her final year that the next generation might confuse haste for progress. Whether that concern was aimed at William directly remains unclear. But in the wake of this storm, one figure emerged from the shadows, not loud, not forceful, but unshakably present. While tradition clashed with ambition, another figure re-emerged, Catherine, whose quiet influence was felt in every room, every decision, and every consequence. She didn't sign the document. She didn't speak on the matter. But make no mistake, Catherine's fingerprints were all over George's elevation. Sources suggest she orchestrated it all behind veiled diplomacy, with the precision of a future queen who understands both timing and power. While the headlines focused on William and the backlash surrounding George's unexpected title, Catherine remained silent, deliberately so. No statements, no subtle gestures. Just the same poised composure that had long become her weapon of choice. But beneath that silence, royal insiders point to a far more active hand. For those who know the rhythm of royal politics, it became clear that the orchestration of George's early appointment was not William's doing alone. It was a long game, meticulously plotted by a woman who spent years mastering the palace's most dangerous art, influence without exposure. She never needed to speak, because everything was already in motion. Those closest to the inner circle describe Catherine as the monarchy's quiet architect. She doesn't fight battles in public, nor does she engage in the petty rivalries that have plagued other royal women before her. Instead, she calculates. Her actions are rarely impulsive. Her choices, especially when it comes to her children, are driven by a long-term vision to not only protect the crown, but to reshape it. In her mind, George's ascension wasn't simply about prestige. It was a shield, a way to secure the future before scandal, division, or generational instability could rip the institution apart once more. She had watched the monarchy stumble too many times. This time, she would act first. There were moments, royal aides say, that confirmed her fingerprints beyond doubt. Private meetings between Catherine and William stretched well into the night, notes exchanged during council dinners, glances that said more than words ever could. She wasn't pushing William, she was guiding him. And the more the storm around George's title grew, the more Catherine retreated into silence, letting others fumble while her plan advanced unchallenged. It wasn't manipulation. It was mastery. But the tension didn't stop at the foot of the throne. Behind the grandeur of recent public engagements, Catherine's relationship with Camilla had begun to strain under the weight of unspoken power struggles. There was a coldness, aides noted, that hadn't been there before. And Camilla, sensing the change, responded with firm restraint never overt, but impossible to ignore. The balance had shifted, and everyone could feel it. What Catherine envisions is not a monarchy ruled by outdated rituals and rigid hierarchies. Her vision is sleek, modern, and emotionally intelligent. A monarchy that engages, that adapts, but most importantly, that survives. This vision, however, stands in stark contrast to Charles and Camilla's reverence for tradition. Where they see preservation, Catherine sees stagnation. Where they seek caution, she demands courage. And while she doesn't challenge them openly, her every move subtly chips away at the old guard's foundation. Still, even Catherine's quiet dominion had its limits. As whispers turned to warnings and factions began dividing the palace corridors, the weight of her strategy triggered something few anticipated: King Charles's intervention. But as the palace began to divide over this decision, King Charles was forced into a rare position to intervene, or let the next generation redefine the monarchy without him. Caught between legacy and loyalty, King Charles faced a dilemma. What followed was a tense series of meetings, a delayed signature, and a monarch grappling with his own irrelevance. At first, the news landed like a thunderclap. Charles, already battling private doubts about his reign's impact and longevity, was blindsided by William's unilateral decision to elevate George. The title of Admiral of the Fleet, once reserved for battle-tested giants of the monarchy, had now been placed in the hands of a boy. And not just any boy, but one who represented the future Charles could feel slipping from his own grasp. His initial response, according to palace insiders, was absolute resistance. There would be no signing, no formal recognition, no ceremonial endorsement. Not yet. Not like this. Charles reportedly summoned his closest circle, Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and two key royal advisors for an emergency meeting behind closed doors. What they discussed was never officially disclosed, but fragments began to leak through the palace walls. Anne, still reeling from the snub against Peter, was said to support the king's instinct to pause. Edward, more cautious by nature, urged reflection rather than reaction, but Charles's own frustration boiled to the surface. In one particularly revealing moment, later repeated by multiple sources, he was overheard declaring, "He's still a child. This isn't a game." That phrase echoed like a warning bell. This wasn't just a ceremonial disagreement. It was a generational collision. A father feeling cornered, a monarch watching his authority diluted in real time. But pressure mounted from William and Catherine's side. They weren't demanding approval. They were presenting a new framework, a monarchy that operated ahead of tradition, not behind it. Catherine's restraint only intensified the pressure. Her silence was read as strength, her poise as challenge. And William, never one to wield words carelessly, made it clear this wasn't a temporary gesture, it was a cornerstone. George's role wasn't symbolic. It was structural. Delay too long, and Charles risked appearing weak, refuse entirely, and he risked fracturing the family publicly. Cornered by modernity and shadowed by doubt, Charles finally relented. The ceremonial co-signing was arranged. The press was briefed. A narrative of unity was woven tightly, hiding the tension beneath. Official photos painted a picture of continuity, but those in the room knew the truth. This was not consensus. It was surrender. And Charles's reluctant nod, while wrapped in royal pageantry, carried the weight of a man who had just conceded control. The palace's framing was immediate and strategic. The moment was spun as a symbol of multi-generational strength. A proud grandfather endorsing his grandson. A king preparing the future. But behind those polished statements was an unmistakable fracture. Charles had given in, but not without consequence. In that silent acquiescence was a flicker of resolve. One final gesture, concealed from the public eye. Because while Charles signed off in public, privately he made a final move, one that could upend everything William had orchestrated. Buried in the royal archives lies a second document, one signed not by William, but by the king himself. Insiders say this counter-order restores a dormant title to Peter Phillips, sparking speculation of a new dual-power strategy or an impending showdown between the old and the new. In the quiet aftermath of the George announcement, just as the press began to tire of speculating, a second ripple emerged, quieter, but no less disruptive. Word leaked that King Charles, mere days after co-signing the naval appointment for his grandson, had drawn up his own document behind closed doors. This wasn't an annulment. It was something far more intricate, a maneuver masked as compensation, but laced with defiance. At the heart of it was an obscure, long-retired designation, Royal Maritime Steward, a ceremonial title with ancient roots, once given to those entrusted with overseeing naval affairs on behalf of the crown, forgotten by most. But now revived, reassigned to Peter Phillips. To some, this was a peace offering, a way to soothe Princess Anne's fury, to appease those still unsettled by George's leapfrogging of tradition. But to others, those who've studied the cadence of Charles's reign, this was something deeper, a strategic rebuttal. A coded message from a monarch who may have signed the document in public, but had not surrendered his authority in spirit. This move reasserted control, not through confrontation, but through counterbalance. Peter, the overlooked royal, was now back in play, not with the same title, but with one the king himself had personally resurrected. A subtle yet undeniable reminder that the old guard still held the pen. Peter's response was, as expected, restrained. He accepted the title without fanfare, offering no interviews, issuing no statements. But those close to him noticed a shift, measured, quiet, but undeniable. Whether it was gratitude or resentment, no one could say for sure. Had he accepted the role as recognition, or was he simply abiding by the palace script, while privately grappling with what could have been? Either way, his re-entry into the spotlight only added more fuel to the fire already raging beneath the royal surface. And just like that, the headlines returned with renewed ferocity. Royal title war, the king's secret countermove. 2 titles, 1 throne. The press latched onto the narrative like a pack sensing blood. Was the king setting the stage for dual lines of influence? Was this a backhanded way of questioning William's judgment? And more critically, what did this mean for the line of succession? If Charles delayed abdication, could this growing power rift turn into a constitutional crisis? Would George's symbolic authority begin to clash with Charles's retained control? Suddenly, a ceremonial role felt dangerously close to real power. Within palace corridors, the ripple turned into a wave. Courtiers scrambled to determine protocol. Advisors found themselves caught between 2 currents, one modern and swift, the other steeped in legacy and leverage. And at the center of it all stood a king who had bent, but not broken. A father who had yielded, but not surrendered. This second document wasn't just about Peter, it was about reasserting relevance. And now, the monarchy found itself teetering between 2 visions, 2 heirs, and 2 very different futures. As the dust settles, the final question looms like a storm cloud. The naval title may be symbolic, but the whispers inside Kensington are deafening. This isn't just preparation, it's preemption. Could the royal family be quietly preparing George to ascend long before the crown is expected to pass? It begins, as it always does, with silence, then subtle shifts, then whispers that build into something far louder than any official announcement. Behind the formality of polished appearances, palace staff have grown increasingly aware of a rising urgency, one they won't speak of on record, but one that echoes through every corridor. King Charles, though still active, is not immortal. His recent health concerns, while minimized in public, have sparked quiet panic among courtiers. His schedule has been softened. Certain overseas visits have been quietly reassigned or deferred. Conversations once focused on legacy are now focused on contingency. And at the center of these talks? Not William. George. Rumors swirl that a confidential dossier has been circulated among key aides, a plan not for ascension, but for emergency regency. If Charles were to step down suddenly, or if crisis demanded swift action, William would take the crown, but George would be made ready overnight, not as a figurehead, but as a symbol of continuity. It's not succession in the traditional sense, it's strategic placement. And Catherine is ensuring every stone is set before anyone realizes what's being built. Her presence in diplomatic affairs has increased noticeably. She now attends confidential briefings typically reserved for senior royals. She's meeting ambassadors solo, taking notes behind closed doors, and when George joins her for these moments, it's not dismissed as ceremonial, it's planned. According to insiders, George has begun receiving private briefings from security personnel and advisors typically reserved for active or near-active royals. His clearance has been quietly elevated. His education, once merely academic, now includes geopolitical dynamics, military structure, and state protocol. He is being trained not just for kingship, but for crisis. There is, of course, precedent. Monarchs crowned young are not unheard of. Elizabeth herself ascended at just 25, thrust into the role by sudden loss. But what separates George's path is its orchestration. This is not the result of tragedy, it's a conscious decision. A design meant to ensure that, should the unthinkable occur, the monarchy doesn't stumble again. No scrambling. No missteps. A line of succession so prepared, it could activate in moments. And William, by all accounts, has already made peace with it. He may wear the crown next, but in his eyes, George is the true future, and that future needs insulation, control, and momentum. So, was the naval title simply an honor? Or was it the first signal of an unspoken plan to ensure a smooth and powerful transition when the time comes, whether years away or sooner than anyone dares to admit? The royal family may not say it aloud, but the moves have already been made. Titles awarded, roles reassigned, protocol rewritten. In a family that speaks in codes, George's rise is becoming the clearest message yet. And so, as the monarchy teeters between past and future, one thing is clear: the crown's next chapter won't begin with ceremony. It will begin with strategy. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.